Okay, good evening everyone, and thank you for coming out on a humid evening, I think. I've opened the windows to try and get a bit of air in. That may give us a problem if we get very noisy revving of engines, which sometimes happens. So if it seems consistent, we can just close the windows down, but hopefully this won't be too bad. In fact, it may even make sense to keep that door open a little bit, so I'll try and let some air through. Well, my name is Joe Houlihan. I run the military history talks here at the BRLSI. I'm delighted to see you all, and many returning faces I know. So tonight's talk, delighted to welcome back Dr. Simon Elliott, who is a good friend of the Brosy and has given several talks here before, all on Roman history. Simon is a prolific author. He's written many books about many aspects of Roman history. He's a broadcaster, he's a writer of articles for many distinguished publications, and I know people who've come to his talks here before have really enjoyed them, so I'm grateful to him for coming back. Tonight's talk, obviously, he will tell you all about it. All I can say that is I'm one of the possibly many people here who studied Tacitus's Agricola for Latin O-level, as it was in my day. And that the story stays with me, but I know that Simon will be looking at many sources beyond just Tacitus's history of his father-in-law, so a completely unbiased history. And the interesting thing is the period in this when this happened, the events of his governorship. We tend to think of the frontier with the Caledonian tribes or the Scottish tribes as being either the Hadrian's Wall or the later Antonine Wall. It was later, wasn't it, Antonine? Yeah. But in fact, when Tacitus was governor of Britain, it was long before either wall was built. So it was a different situation then, and Simon Elliott will tell us all about it. Please welcome Dr. Simon Elliott.
Scotland. There are two Romans who could truly claim, I think, to have conquered the far north of Britain. Only two.
Simon, I'm interrupt for our viewers online. You stay very close to that microphone. Everyone can hear you here, but online they won't hear you.
Joe, do you want to tether me? Because I like walking. Right, I'll stand here, immobile. There are two Romans who can truly claim to have conquered the whole of the main island of Britain. One was Septimius Severus at the beginning of the 3rd century, which is the talk I was honoured to give you last year. But the first one is Agricola. In actual fact, Agricola is the one who can really, truly claim to have conquered the far north, as you will see. Only two of them. They're the only two main attempts the Romans made to conquer the far north of Britain. And I go into the whys and wherefores in this presentation. That's the front cover of the book. I'm going to let you into a secret, actually. So I think it's a beautiful front cover. It's a painting by my great friend Graham Sumner. Graham Sumner is Welsh, and when he painted that, it was actually meant to be an auxiliary cavalryman in Wales. But we thought it was such a good picture that we'd use it on the front cover of the book. And next to it, I get to use for the first time an image from a Ladybird book. That's from the Ladybird book of Julius Caesar and Roman Britain, which is a fantastic book. But it does show you how important Agricola is, because he's one of the few named individuals in that book, which many of us all grew up with. I think Agricola is one of the most important people in British history, full stop, let alone in Roman Britain, particularly, as I'll tell you as I finish my presentation, because events in his reign effectively set in place the political settlement of the Britain which we live in today. So I'll begin. I'll talk for about 45 minutes, and then I'm happy to take any questions at the end. I've got some books on sale as well, mates rates. So if you want to buy a book, come and see me at the end, and I'm happy to sign it for you. So Agricola in the modern world. Agricola is all around us in the modern world. I'll come to Bath in a second, but this is in the National Gallery in Scotland in the beautiful main hall. This is the pantheon of important people from Roman Britain as detailed in the late 19th century. You have Septimius Severus, shown with notably white skin in that picture, which is unusual. Antoninus Pius, and then Hadrian, There's Agricola there looking very proud and stern with a big Roman nose, etc. And then, of course, his son-in-law Tacitus next to him with his scroll because he's writing his father-in-law's story. I'll come to Tacitus later. Here is Agricola again in the modern world. So here's our famous statue in the Roman baths in Bath, literally over there, and another statue of Agricola which is outside the town hall in Manchester as well. So this is an individual that people in the 19th and 20th and 21st centuries acknowledge is an important figure, but I'm going to demonstrate why he's a very important figure in the story of Roman Britain. So today I'm going to give you a bit of background about Britain in the late 1st century AD, and Joe mentioned the Britain of Agricola being different from the one we envisage with Hadrian's Wall and the Antonine Wall, etc. Well, I'll actually explain that to you. I'm then going to talk about the Principate Roman military, because this is very much a story about military conquest. And then I'll move on to Agricola, and I'll talk about the sources, including Tacitus, and then I'll give you details of his early life, because in actual fact, one of the things I found fascinating was to really get to know Agricola through his early life and his experiences as he grew up, so his early life. And then Agricola came to Britain 3 times when he was progressing through his cursus honorum, aristocratic career path for a Roman senator. Firstly, he was a junior officer with Legio II Augusta, normally based in Exeter or Caerleon in the southwest. However, almost certainly he took part in the Boudiccan revolt fighting with Paulinus, so I'll detail that. Later, he came over to be the legate, so the general in charge of Legio XX Valeria Victrix, which is the legion that founded the legionary fortress phase of Roman Chester, and he fought on the west coast of Britain, and again, I'm going to detail that for you. And then finally, I'll talk about Agricola's campaigns as the governor in Britain from 77 through to 83, taking into account his campaigns in Wales, and then in the north against the Brigantes, then the far north, so into the region of modern Scotland, then a consolidation year, and then in the southwest of Scotland, and the debate about whether to invade Ireland or not. Then the far north again, and finally his endgame campaign with the Battle of Mons Graupius. And then I'll finish by talking about his circumnavigation of Britain, the complete province, how Domitian celebrated this, the first time he showed any interest in Britain, in fact the only time he showed any interest in Britain whatsoever, and then his later life and death. Okay, so that's the presentation today. Most slides are pictures I'll talk to, 1 or 2 are word heavy, if you'll forgive me, but most are pictures. So, how do we get to a stage where Agricola comes over to try and conquer the far north? It all begins with the Claudian invasion in AD 43 under the great general Aulus Plautius, when 40,000 troops land, I think, probably on the east coast of Kent. And then you get a series of breakout campaigns. It's very interesting to consider. Julius Caesar managed to conquer Gaul to the extent where it could become part of the Roman world in 6 years. It took the Romans over 40 to get to a stage where they could claim that the majority of the main island of Britain was conquered. So for the Romans, it was not an easy conquest, and it's a series of slices and then stop, and then a slice and then stop. So you have the initial conquest campaigns under these governors. So Aulus Plautius, when the province is effectively here at the end of 43. Then in the late AD 40s, under Plautius and then Scapula, they move up. And so you get Legio IX Hispana moving into the Midlands, founding Leicester, then founding Lincoln. You get Legio XX Valeria Victrix, consolidating the southwest. You get southeast, you get Legio II Augusta going into the southwest under Vespasian, and you get Legio XIV Gemina as well going into the Midlands here. So that's under Plautius and Scapula, and then there's a stop line. And often this stop line is called the Fossway frontier, because broadly at that point, the stop line's here between the Severn and the Wash. And it's only under Gallus, Varanus and Paulinus that you then start finding the Romans going into the territory of Wales, which by the end of this period they still haven't fully conquered, especially the north, and we'll see why. So you have this series of slices like this. So by the time Agricola's ready, and we'll talk about it later, in his second visit to start conquering the northwest, founding Manchester and founding Carlisle, this is above the provincial area from the earlier phase. So at this early stage, let's just consider what Roman Britain looked like. So as the Romans came over, these are the major tribal groupings. in Britain, which are the ones who are integrated into the Roman province. You can see here the key thing for us is that the Brigantes before the Flavian period were a Roman client state, so they weren't conquered. They actually helped the Romans, and in fact it was Cartimandua who helped capture Caraticus as an example. And it's only into the Flavian period when you have this desperate need for the new dynasty, which has replaced the Julio-Claudians, that you get the need for martial success to celebrate the new dynasty, that the Romans look to the far north. But again, we'll consider that as we go on. And this, again to contextualize, is Roman Britain probably to the point of the mid-AD 50s. Okay, so Wales still isn't fully conquered, the north of England isn't conquered, the far northern Ireland certainly aren't conquered. At this stage, the capital is in Colchester, and you can see here this really nice artist's impression of Colchester. So some of the foundations of the theatre you can still see today, in actual fact, and the castle, Colchester Castle and Museum is about here, and that's broadly where Colchester High Street is there. So, what happens to Britain during this period? Well, I'm going to use a phrase which is controversial in academia, but I find it's very useful, especially when you're speaking in public, and I'm going to talk about Romanization. So how did Britain become a Roman province? Well, we're talking about a social process by which elites first, and then much of the rest of society buy into the Roman way of life. So the Romans are very clever. It's almost a conceit in the way that they actually incorporate a province. What they tend to do is lend lots of money to the aristocrats, the elites, in the conquered territory to buy into the Roman way of life. But once they've lent them the money, they're in, they can't get out. And that certainly happened in the region of modern England, but not in the region of modern Scotland. It's an evolutionary process, not revolutionary. So once the territory is conquered, it probably takes a generation for it to be fully incorporated. That's certainly the experience that the Romans had in Gaul. Then you start getting these real manifestations of Romanitas and Romanization taking place. So Mediterranean stone-built urban infrastructure, so towns and cities and public buildings. Roman-style dwellings, so in a Roman townhouse in a town or a city, a villa or a villa estate in the countryside. The worship of the Roman pantheon, often very cleverly incorporating, as we know in Bath, as a great example, local deities. A monetary economy with coin use, which, to give you some context, if we say that the Roman occupation, as it's called, of Britain ended about sort of 410, 415, there's no real evidence of coins being used after 430. So the use of coins is a real tell that it's part of the Roman world. Industry and improved agriculture, the use of Latin and Roman fashion. So now, Britain is part of the wider Roman Empire. I'll go back now, I'll talk now about what happened at the end of this conquest period, because you have a period of consolidation in the AD 50s, and then all of a sudden there's this dramatic event, the Boudiccan Revolt, AD 60, 61, which I'll talk about in greater detail later, because it's part of Agricola's own story. But here we have Boudica leading her troops, probably at what we call today the Battle of Watling Street. And then after that, the province begins to change. So the capital moves from Colchester, which has been sacked, to London, which has also been sacked. But London is in a much better place because it's a mercantile city. It's a much better place to be the centre of the capital of Roman Britain, because Nero clearly decided after the Boudiccan Revolt had been defeated to double down and really emphasise that Britain was going to stay part of the Roman Empire. So this is the first manifestation of the Neronian city, the Fenchurch Street marching camp built after the Boudiccan Revolt. But then we move on to the year of the four emperors. So we've gone from AD 60-61, we've had Britain now doubled down as part of the Roman world in the 60s, and now we have change. So we have the Julio-Claudians, the last one is Nero, commits suicide, and then we have the four sequential emperors in the year of the four emperors, with Galba. Otto plays an important role in the story of Agricola, Vitellius, and ultimately Vespasian, who's the victor, and he brings in the Flavian dynasty. And it's in that period, as we'll see, that Agricola makes his name in his third visit to Britain. The Flavian emperors, so Vespasian, I love Vespasian, he's one of my favourite emperors. Titus wasn't emperor long enough to really make a name for himself, but was a very successful general. And then Domitian, one of my 3 least favourite Roman emperors, as you'll see later. The other 2, in case you're interested, number 1's Commodus, number 2 is Caracalla, and number 3 is Domitian. So we now move on to the next phase of the Roman conquest of Britain. So we've had 43 to the mid-50s, where we've had broadly the 7 to the Humber and parts of Wales. We've had the Boudiccan revolt. We've then had the year of the 4 emperors, and we have the Flavians coming in, and the Flavian emperors want to make their name in a martial sense. It's a new dynasty. Vespasian's a soldier, he's a very successful soldier, he's a great figure in Roman history. So the Romans need to pick a fight. So where do you pick a fight in the Roman Empire where there's a good chance of getting martial glory, but you're not that likely to lose? So you could choose Syria and fight the Parthians, but the problem there is half the time the Parthians win. So you're not going to choose that because it's a bad signal to send to the world of Rome that the dynasty is not that successful. You could choose the Rhine or the Danube, but again, there's a fair chance that you could lose. So they choose to pick a fight in the far north of Britain. And actually, they pick sort of a really soft fight as well. They actually decide to target one of their own client states. So you have a series of Roman governors in Britain. These are the warrior governors of this period. So Belanus actually was made governor by Vitellius, but he's also a friend of Vespasian. So he stays after AD 69, and he starts campaigning into the north of England. So he's now starting to campaign against the Brigantes. You then get Cerealis. Cerealis is an ill-favoured Roman general earlier on because he lost a battle against Boudicca near Colchester. But he fought very well for Vespasian in the Batavian revolt in AD 70. So he's made the governor in Britain. And it's he who orders the 9th Legion to move up from Lincoln and found York. So York's founded by Cerealis with the 9th Legion. And he more or less conquers up to the line that later becomes Hadrian's Wall. You then get a governor called Frontinus, a very famous person in the Roman world actually, as an architect. He was an architect, very famous for designing aqueducts. And at one stage he was the man responsible for the aqueducts in Rome for the emperor, which by the way is a big job because it means you have to report to the emperor personally every single day. So he's a big name in the Roman world, and he's actually the man who more or less finally conquers Wales, apart from the top northwest corner. And then finally, as we'll see, we have Agricola, who becomes the governor in 77-78. So, talking about the Principate Roman military, when I say the Principate is the first half of the Roman Empire, the Dominate is the second half of the Roman Empire, the dividing line is AD 284 when Diocletian becomes the emperor. So this is the Principate, and it's the height of the Principate as well. I always like seeing a big bloke in Lorica Segmentata, and having worn it on camera, I can tell you actually as a taller gentleman, it's actually quite difficult to wear, so good luck to him. But I'll actually show you with these images what the Roman legionary would wear. So the legionary is one of 3 branches of the Principate Roman military. So the legionary is, to me, the elite warrior or soldier of the ancient world. And you can see here that the legionary, the Principate period with Agricola, is wearing his imperial Gallic helmet, which is amazing head protection. It's called an imperial Gallic helmet because the design's originally Gallic, and then the Romans been amazingly good at nicking other people's ideas, bolted stuff onto it. So you get this brow ridge so that when the blow comes on the top, it can stop it. You get the neck guard, same reason on the neck. You get these ear defenders as well, and crucially, you can hear out of it as well. So that's a really phenomenal piece of military technology. This is Lorica Segmentata, one of 3 kinds of armour that the legionary would have worn at this period. The 2 are Lorica Hamata, chainmail, and Lorica Squamata, scale mail. The one most often depicted, for example, on Trajan's column or on the column of Marcus Aurelius, is Lorica Segmentata. It's basically banded iron armour, and the key to its success is not the bands of iron armour, actually, it's the clasps that hold it together, because it's very flexible. And if you want to find real evidence, as I've done in 2 or 3 of my recent excavations, that you have a Roman legionary there in the past, it's those clasps appearing, the links that hold the armour together. They're pretty hard wearing actually as well, they're usually brass. You have the gladius stabbing sword, so the Roman legionary of this period, his principal weapon is the sword. He has his pilum weighted throwing javelins with the lead weights, but they're thrown before contact. He's principally a swordsman with a very specific fencing technique, which is to take the blow of the opponent on his shield, I'll discuss in a second, and then once the opponent's thorax is open, kill them there or kill them there. It's an industrial scale killing machine. That's what we're talking about. And this is the scutum body shield, and here you can see that they're in the testudo, which is the famous Roman tortoise formation when they're fighting troops with missile weapons. This is the Roman Legion of the Principate, 5,500 men. So you've got the first cohort, which is the largest, then 9 other smaller cohorts. These are the Roman legionary cavalry. There at the front is your legatus, your legate general. You can see there the Aquilifer, the main standard bearer with his eagle standard, the Aquila. The Aquila only comes out of the legionary fortress if the whole legion is on the march. And if the Aquila's lost, it brings shame and damnation on the legion. Think of the 3 that were lost by Varus in the Teutoburg forest in AD 9 when Augustus said, "Give me back my legions." Well, what he meant was, "Give me back my eagles." And it took the Romans 20 years to get them back, but they did. That's how important that one standard is. That is your Roman Legion of the Principate. But the second troop type of this period is the auxiliary. So when Augustus became the first emperor around 27 BC, as part of his reforms of the Roman military, he kept the legionaries, but instead of having allied troops or mercenaries, he converted them into official troops called auxiliaries, which are almost, not quite, but almost as good as the legionaries. And they're very important to the story of Agricola, as you'll see. The auxiliaries also provided all of the Roman cavalry in this period. By the way, a lot of people think Roman auxiliaries aren't as scary as legionaries, but actually most of them that were recruited to fight in Britain came from modern Belgium or northern Holland or the Rhineland, the Batavians, the Frisians, etc. And there were headhunters. So that's why very often when you see a tombstone for a Roman auxiliary cavalryman, he's holding the head of a beheaded enemy, because that's what they did. They were properly scary. So who knew that Hadrian's Wall was held by terrifying Belgians? The auxiliaries also provided the archers in the missile troops, usually archers in Roman armies of this period as well. This chap here is based on an image on Trajan's column. That's an Eastern archer. The ones who fought in the West would have looked different, but nevertheless, they were all auxiliaries. And finally, the thing that most people forget about the Roman military is the fleet. So the Roman fleet of the Principate was called the Classis, in Britain was called the Classis Britannica, the subject of my first book, Sea Eagles of Empire, which is the only one of my books at the moment on sailing waterstones, but nevertheless, I've been there and signed some for them. This is a Liburne. So at this point, the Romans have no symmetrical, if they're the same numbers, symmetrical threat at sea. So therefore, the Navy has gone from having the huge polyreme galleys of the 1st century BC towards the end of the 1st century AD, having small nippy biremes called Liburne. That's because the fleet most often fought with the army when the army was on land. The fleet would fight along the coast, and also, don't forget, down the river systems as well. If you think about nearly every major Roman town in Britain, in fact, most of the major towns in Britain today, they all began as Roman forts on river systems. And that's because they needed to get the fleet to supply them or to help them when they were campaigning. The fleet plays a very important role in the story of Agricola, as we'll see. People often forget to talk about the opponents that the Romans faced at this stage as well. So when Agricola's fighting the various tribes in the far north, Ptolemy lists about 30 tribes, confederations in the far north of Britain, often just called Caledonians today. This is how they're depicted. So I play toy soldiers. You're going to see that I play toy soldiers in a minute, because I've actually woven it into my presentation. This is the box cover of Ancient Britons by Warlord Games. And you can see here, basically, these guys are pretty well toured up. So they've got shields, they've all got swords, etc. In actual fact, the far northern Britons that Agricola would have fought were probably armed principally with a short spear, a small shield. If they're lucky, they'd have a dagger. If they're incredibly lucky, they'd have a sword. But broadly, you're talking about spearmen with a short spear and a small shield, making maximum use of their knowledge of local terrain and weather to counter the far superior Roman military technology. The elites still rode in chariots, though, so these are the same kinds of chariots that Julius Caesar talks about in 55 and 54 BC. We're moving forward to the late 70s, early 80s AD, and these chariots are still the same ones, in this case being used by the elites in the far north of Britain. So, briefly I'll go through some of the principal sources I've used. There are many sources you can use, but the three principal ones I've used. Tacitus, problematic, mainly because Agricola's his father-in-law. And the Agricola is written after the death of Agricola himself to record his life. Because as you'll see, Agricola's last few years were not happy, and basically he didn't have a good relationship with Domitian. Not many people did. And so this is Tacitus's way of setting, as he saw it, the record straight. A lot of people think Tacitus was with Agricola on campaign. There's no evidence that I can find of it, and I've really looked. So almost certainly he's relying on first-person testimony after the event by Agricola talking to his son-in-law. The other problem you have with Tacitus is that because he's putting his father-in-law on a pedestal, he diminishes every single other governor before Tacitus in Roman Britain. And we know from other sources that certainly Bolanus, Cerealis, and Frontinus were very successful themselves, but he denigrates them. So there's always this question mark, but what you do have with Tacitus is that rarest thing from the classical world, a full biography, which is an amazing thing. So I just have to use my historian skills, and I'm an active archaeologist as well, to try and see what I think is the true picture. And then you can triangulate it with other sources. So Cassius Dio is one of my favourite Roman sources. Suetonius, of course, etc. So we can get, I think, as accurate a picture as we can get about the real story of Agricola, which is what I put in the book. So his early life, one-wordy slide, and then lots of pictures. He was born in AD 40 in Forum Julii, which is in Gallia Narbonensis. So this is the Mediterranean coast of France, and in this case, it's the southeast of France, quite near the Alps. It's a very important mercantile town, very close to Marseille. Also, very importantly, a naval base for another Roman regional fleet. In this case, the Classis Britannia, which is the Tyrolean fleet, which is Tyrrhenian fleet, which is headquartered at Misenum in the Bay of Naples. Now, his father is an important aristocrat, made a senator later in life. He was an equestrian to start with, called Lucius Julius Graecinus. You can see there he's a member of the Julii clan, the Julii Gentes. So they associate themselves with Julius Caesar. His mother's called Julia Procea, and you can again see that she's part of the Julii Gentes. But this is an important part to note. Agricola never knew his father because shortly after his birth, his father was executed on the orders of Caligula. And it appears as though Agricola's father was quite fond of his own voice and chose the wrong day to make a joke in front of Caligula, and he was executed almost immediately. So he was raised by his mother. So Agricola never knew his father, but the family kept their wealth so that the family status wasn't diminished, just the individual leader was removed. He was then raised in Freyas, so Forum Julii, educated in Marseille, and his mother moved in with him to Marseille to make sure he had the best education possible. He began his cursus honorum around AD 58. So Forum Julii is there. You can see it's on this crucial Mediterranean road, a really important military trunk road there. There's Marseille, so you can see, and where's Lyon? There, so there's Lyon, so there's the Rhone and the Saône. So this is a really, really rich part of the Roman world. He's born into a very rich family, but his father's killed. This is Forum Julii, as it would have been experienced by Agricola, classic Roman, successful mercantile town. That's the statue there of Agricola in Frejus, Forum Julii today. That's Forum Julii, that's the naval base. So when we say naval base, it's a serious naval base. And that is Marseille of the same period as well. So I mean, he's growing up sort of in the heartland of the imperial centre in the Roman Empire, surrounded by wealth, but he never knew his father. So he's progressing on his cursus honorum. He has some junior magistracies in Rome and in southern Gaul, and then he gets his first posting. His first posting is to become a junior officer, one of the 5 tribunes of Legio II Augusta, which at this stage, and we're talking about the late 50s, early 60s, is bouncing around in the southwest between Exeter here and Caerleon here, okay? So this is the region that that's where he's posted to. But it appears that he got very lucky. So when he arrived in the province, he was seconded onto the staff as an officer, a beneficiary as they're called, for the governor Paulinus, another great warrior governor of Rome and Britain. So he didn't spend very long with Legio II, which is a good thing for his career, as we'll see, because he's now with Paulinus on the governor's staff. Remember, in a Roman province, you have 2 people at the top: the governor, who is the military and legal representative of the emperor, and the procurator, who's the chancellor in charge of making money from the province. The Romans only had provinces to make money. They didn't do it because it was nice, they wanted to make money. So you have a governor and a procurator. So the governor is the military and legal boss. So Agricola is now on the staff of the military and legal boss. And to start with, he's up here with Legio 14 Gemina and 20 Valeria Victrix, helping Paulinus almost conquer Anglesey and the far northwest of Wales. However, we then, 60-61, get the incendiary revolt of Boudica in North Norfolk, and Boudica, with her between 100 and 250,000, 230,000 people, according to Cassius Dio, that's a very big number, by the way, comes down and sacks Colchester, and then sacks London. At this point, Paulinus has heard what's happening. He's now coming down, picks up Watling Street in Wroxeter. He's coming down Watling Street here. Boudica's moving up to cause a meeting engagement because she needs to get a quick victory. By the way, I think if Boudica had won, that would have been the end of Roman Britain, because that would have been 4 legions gone, a legion more than Varus lost. And remember, the Romans never again tried to conquer Germania after Varus lost 3 legions. If Boudica had won and the Romans had lost 4 legions, I think Nero would have called it quits, and that would have been the end of Roman Britain. But fortunately, Paulinus was on his A game at the battle, today called the Battle of Watling Street. I think it personally, and everybody has an opinion, I think the best candidate site for it, and I've actually said this on camera, on Channel 5 and Channel 4, is near Daventry at Church Stowe, which is a perfect location based on the primary sources. So the battle takes place, and here's Boudica exhorting her troops, 250,000, 100,000, far more than the Romans. The Romans probably had about 10,000 to battle. But here's my first demonstration of my wargame soldiers. So this is in my games room at home. These are the mass ranks of the Britons. Here are the thin red line of Roman legionaries and auxilia, holding a bowl-shaped valley as Boudica charges up. And you imagine the engagement, and just think Agricola almost certainly was there, okay? So I personally think, and I've actually written this in my various works, Boudica's army at this time was probably about 100,000, which about 30 to 40,000 may have been warriors. It's probably an agglomeration of various tribes in the southeast, all of whom joined the revolt apart from the Cantiac in Kent. So Paulinus has got 10,000, so whatever the numbers are, Paulinus is heavily outnumbered. if Boudicca's coming up Watling Street, she meets the bowl-shaped valley described by the primary sources, I think loses control of the army because they want to get it over with as quickly as possible. They all charge basically at the Romans. Now, the stop line there around Church Stowe has 3 or 4 forts nearby, all of which would have been heavily equipped to maintain the Roman campaigns to the northwest in Wales. So I think here, actually, Paulinus's troops are very well tooled up. I think they've got more artillery, as an example, than you would normally find in a Roman force. And this force is comprising Legio 40 Gemina, part of Legio 20 Valeria Victrix, a few stragglers from Legio 9 Hispana, and then some auxiliaries and auxiliary cavalry. So the Boudiccan troops approach Paulinus and Agricola, and then the ballista and the scorpions start firing the artillery. So the front ranks are being whittled down. And then the bows start firing at the Britons, and they're coming and coming, but they're stumbling. And then they're getting javelin range of the auxiliaries, and they're getting slingshot range of the auxiliaries. Finally, the legionaries unleash the first pillar, and then at point blank range, the final heavy pillar's thrown. The ranks of the Britons are down, and then that's when Paulinus orders the legionaries to form a cuenus, a wedge formation, a series of wedges, so it's like the cutting edge of a saw, and they go downhill and annihilate the Britons. So that's the end of the Boudiccan revolt. The province is saved. And Agricola almost certainly was there. So what happens after this? Well, this is Agricola's story again. So he returns to Gaul and then marries. He becomes sequentially a questor and then a praetor in Rome. These are 2 magistracies of increasing importance. Then in AD 69, the year of the 4 emperors, he supports Vespasian, who is eventually victorious and becomes the emperor. The reason he supports Vespasian probably is because Otto earlier had unleashed some of his navy around the region where Agricola's mother was living, and his mother was killed. So he lost his father before he knew him, and then his mother was murdered by marines from Otto's fleet. But he chooses well because he advances under the Flavians with the victorious Vespasian, and he now goes to Britain with Cerealis and becomes the legate, the general in charge of 20 Valeria Victrix. And in this period, Cerealis is conquering the Brigantes in the north of England, and he himself, Cerealis the governor, is on the east coast and Agricola is on the west coast. And it's in this campaign, which is highly successful, so this is when we drive the line of the province up to the Solway Firth Tyne, where we have Chester being founded as a legionary fortress by Agricola, Manchester being founded as a fort by Agricola, and Carlisle being founded as a fort by Agricola. So there we have Mamucium. This is Manchester. That is today's Deansgate in Manchester. And then there we have Lugavallum. So Lugavallum, Roman Carlisle. So when you go to Carlisle today, the castle is broadly here, and the bathhouse being excavated expertly, by the way, I have to say, from the Severan period is just over here there. All founded by Agricola. So Agricola campaigns well for Cerealis. He then gets promoted again, and he becomes the governor of Gallia Aquitania in southwestern Gaul. His daughter then marries Cornelius Tacitus, so we have his son-in-law biographer in place. Then in 77 he's appointed back to Britain again by Vespasian to become the governor. And this is the Roman London that Agricola would have known, torched by Boudicca, so just being rebuilt with the new street patterns coming out today. And this street here is modern Cheapside, which comes down here and becomes Oxford Street. This is the Britain that Agricola comes back to. So we have the fully conquered and incorporated, most of Wales, not the northwest, and then most of the Midlands and the south from the River Dee, probably up to the Humber, okay? And then Cerealis has conquered the Brigantes in the north and driven the border up to here, but that's still being consolidated. So this area here is all fine. This area here in the province is still being consolidated. So there's still work to do there. There's definitely work to do in northwestern Wales because that still hasn't been conquered. So you can see here what Agricola's got to do. So his first campaign in 77 is to conquer the northwest of Wales. Why is he doing this? He doesn't want an enemy in his rear when he's been given very specific orders, I think, by Vespasian, really finish the job in the far north. Okay, let's get it finished in the far north. So the first job is to finish off resistance in Wales. Highly successful. Wales is now part of the province. And here you can see a 19th century image of the Romans torching Anglesey and finally defeating the Druids. Then in AD 78, he has a year consolidating in the far north of England in Brigantian territory. So here, what he does, he builds about 100 forts in northern England, many of which become towns in modern Britain. So I live in northeast Derbyshire, so for me, if I look to my west, I've got Chesterfield, the Caister by the Fields, a Roman fort, Agricola. I've got Doncaster, and I've got Rotherham, all Roman forts founded by Agricola. So there's Danham, which is Roman Doncaster. Corbridge there, just south of Hadrian's Wall, that's founded by Agricola. And so what he's doing here is he's doing exactly the same as he did in northwestern Wales. He's making sure that his rear is secure when he moves to the far north. He's locking the region down. I personally don't think there was ever any love lost between the people of the north of modern England and the Romans, simply because it always has this massive military presence there, which bends the nature of the local economy. But it's Agricola who locks it down to the extent where he can now start thinking properly about going into the far north, the region of modern Scotland. And you can see his various campaigns here. So I'll do them sequentially. This is a pretty good map, actually. So the Brigantes in 78 have been locked down. It's Agricola who builds the line of the Staingate Road, which goes from Carlisle to Corbridge, so broadly here to here, linking the Solway Firth with the Tyne. Doesn't go all the way through to what became Newcastle, which also is founded by Agricola, by the way. But the Staingate Road here, which becomes the Staingate Frontier, which is when you have forts like Vindolanda built, these are Agricola in the Flavian period. So he's ready. So in 79 he pounces, and this is one of the most successful military campaigns in British history. In this first year, I think he catches the native peoples of the far north completely by surprise. And the evidence from marching camps, we're very fortunate in Scotland that we can track various campaigns by the size of the marching camp. We know that Agricola's army was 30,000 strong, and his fleet was 7,000 strong in terms of manpower. So therefore, it helps us track the various marching camps. So we know that in that campaign, Agricola ended up right up here. Ray Dykes there's next to Stonehaven. So this is the Highland line. The strategy is very simple. You hammer through the Scottish borders with 30,000 men. The people there can't resist you. You get to the Firth of Forth, you build a bridge of boats, you then go up the Highland line here, building Glenblocker forts to close off all the glens, the valleys. So the Highlands here are cut off from the lowlands here, and you cover the maritime flank with the fleet. So the people here either give in to the Romans, flee, or die. It's a brutally efficient campaign. So by the end of AD 79, I actually think in the first year, Agricola's probably up here. This is Rough Castle on later a fort on the Antonine War, which dates to that period. Then another consolidating year in AD 80, so he's now manning the various forts permanently, and gradually it's dawning on the natives there that this isn't just the Romans going in the far north, looking for some plunder and going home. They're here to stay. And so the resistance tightens. And this is the year, I think, when you start getting lots of refugees going through this narrow gap here near Stonehaven between the Highland line and the coast. and they're going to join all the unconquered tribes in Aberdeenshire and the Grampian Mountains and on the Moray Firth shoreline. It's in this year in AD 80 that we get one of the best known Roman forts in Britain built, which is Tremontium, Newstead, near the beautiful town of Melrose in the Scottish borders. So there it is. This is the Flavian Agricolan fort constructed here. There's the Vicar's settlement. And I think the amphitheatre is, the actual amphitheatre is here. Then in AD 81, it's a very important year, AD 81, in British history, in actual fact, the whole of British history, I think. Because firstly, Agricola has unfinished business in the Scottish borders, because the Novanti in the southwest, here, have started revolting. So he campaigns against them, which includes what is described by Tacitus as a maritime assault. And the theory that most people have is that there is a maritime assault. Agricola pins the Novanti down here, and then does a maritime assault into their rear here, and quickly they're defeated. But all of a sudden, he's looking across Ireland. And to do the maritime assault, he's got most of the Classis Britannia with him in the Solway Firth. So this is the point where he considers trying to conquer Ireland. He thinks he can do it with one legion. Whether he could or not, we don't know, but this is what his thinking was. So he sends word to Domitian to ask for permission to invade Ireland. And Domitian says no. So Domitian's only just become the emperor. Domitian is not a military hero like his father and elder brother. He wants to make his own name. I will call him ill-favoured, but I've already told you, I don't like him. So Domitian's much more interested in winning battles himself on the Danube against the Dacians, later conquered by Trajan. So he's got no interest in Britain. He's looking for excuses to actually get Agricola to finish the campaign in the far north so he can bring troops back from Britain to help him, which is what happened, because later it's Domitian who removes Legio 14 Gemina, probably the elite Roman legion in Britain, to fight with him on the Danube. And it ends up being based in Carnuntum near Vienna. So he says no, because he wants Agricola to finish off, and he wants to make his own name. This is important because at some stage Agricola seems to have thought that he was going to get permission. Maybe Titus had told him, that's a good idea, see how you get on. So it looks as though Agricola's plan was to turn Chester into the provincial capital of a unified province of both main islands of Britain, because it's more or less in the middle. London's too far from Ireland, but Chester, this is another view of Castrodeva, Roman Chester. So why do we think this? Well, in Chester, in the archaeological record, there are some very unusual things. Firstly, it's the biggest legionary fortress in Roman Britain. So the four main ones are York, Caerleon, and Chester, and there was one at Touchhill, which is on the Tay, Agricolan, but there were four. And the three stone-built ones were Caerleon, Chester, and York. Now, let's think about this. Chester is the biggest legionary fortress in Britain. It's got the finest walls of a legionary fortress in Britain, the only decorated walls of a legionary fortress in Britain. It's also got buildings which were half finished in the Flavian period under Agricola, but then abandoned. And these are very grand buildings of the type you find in Roman London. So, for example, an imperial reception suite here, which had these alcoves, each of which would have had probably a bust of an emperor, which would have been where the governor would receive people. You have very, very, very high quality lead, wastewater and freshwater piping, all stamped with Agricolan stamps. But it all stops in the Flavian period, and only that one building is restarted, but about 200 years later, very oddly. So it looks as though Agricola thought he'd got permission, started constructing buildings in Chester to turn them into the provincial capital. Then word came back from Domitian, you can't do it, so he stopped. That's important because it means that from that point, Ireland goes in its own direction in the political story of Britain. There's Domitian, and there are the Dacians who he actually wants the Romans to fight, not the people in the far north of Britain. So in AD 82, he goes to the far north again, and he starts probing here. Now, Severus, early 3rd century, didn't get any further than here. So he basically conquered, before he died in York, he conquered what we call the Scottish lowlands today. But Agricola wants to really finish the job, so he wants to get up into Aberdeenshire, so he starts probing here. And then on the Tay, he starts building some really big logistics bases. This is actually in Tuchhill. If you can get a chance, go to in Tuchhill on the Tay, because you can see the outlines of all these buildings on the ground and walk over them, and the walls and the ditches. It's a really, really huge, beautiful Roman legionary fortress, only in use for 10 months. And again, I have a galley there, a Liburnian, a Bireme, simply because, remember, the fleet's always in action. Finally, the big year, AD 83, the year of the Battle of Mons Graupius. Did this battle take place as described by Tacitus? I detail my thoughts in the book, but probably I think it did. It's the only meeting engagement, a huge meeting engagement we have in the history of the Roman engagement in the far north of Britain. Severus could never force the people in the far north to battle. They fought a guerrilla war against them. Here, I think Agricola basically got so far north into the remaining territories of the surviving Britons of the far north that they had no choice but to fight. So you had the Battle of Mons Graupius, with the native Britons led by this figure called Calgacus. Did Calgacus exist as Tacitus describes? Who knows? Who knows? But certainly if the battle took place, there must have been a leader of significance to actually put what we think is about 30,000 troops in the field. And the Romans had about 30,000 troops as well. Where did it take place? Probably, let me just go back a couple. So here's the Grampians. The location most people think was the site of Mons Graupius was the Benaki range about here, okay, a Mither Tap. So I broadly think that's about right, because it fits the descriptions. So this is the Eastern Grampians, the Benaki range. So you're looking at the battle taking place somewhere here. The descriptions that we have from the primary sources are that Calgacus arrayed his troops on the slopes with the Romans below in front of their marching camps. This is a really good, I know it's only a scribble, but actually this is the most accurate map that I use when I'm talking about Mons Graupius, because it literally is what Tacitus says. So you've got Calgacus' troops here on the slopes of the Benaki range, infantry, mix of mounted light cavalry and infantry, chariots and cavalry on the flanks. And the Romans, this is interesting, auxiliary cavalry on the flanks, check. A reserve of auxiliary cavalry, check. The Roman legionary at the back, okay. And then the auxiliaries at the front. This is interesting, because in this battle, the legionaries didn't take part. And I actually discussed this in the book about why the legionaries didn't take part. And I think you have to go back to Varus. So with the Varian disaster in AD 9, that I think had a huge psychological impact on the Roman military. Roman military leaders from that point were desperate not to lose a legion. And these legions, I think, were under strength. So he got all four with him, 2 Augusta, 9 Hispana, 14 Gemina, and 20 Valeria Victrix. But I think they're under strength because they've been campaigning for so long, certainly in these campaigns with Agricola 4 or 5 years. And it's easier, I think, to get reinforcements to replace battlefield casualties into auxiliary units than it is for a legionary unit, because the auxiliary units fighting here are all from the Rhine Delta, and they're largely given peoples, you know, Ala 1 Frisia or Ala 1 Aquitania or something like that. So the locals effectively in Europe, so it's easy to replace them as battlefield casualties. Whereas for the legionaries, it's not, because they're actually recruited in the imperial centre, in Italy, southern Spain, North Africa, so it's more difficult to get replacements over. So I think Agricola is fighting shy of losing a legion here. He's only going to put his legions in play if he really needs to. Fortunately, he doesn't need to, because the auxiliaries are on their A game. A Paulinus Boudiccan defeat level A game. So this is the Osprey image of the Battle of Mons Graupius from Wikicommons, which is a very good image actually. Here you can see Calgacus' chariots running up and down in front. Then we have the auxiliaries and the legionaries all behind. This is a recreation on the wargaming tabletop. in the War Games room of Rick Priestley, who's probably the world's most famous gamer because he invented Warhammer. He's made enough money to have 2 War Games rooms. I only have 1 War Games room. So this is his enormous War Games table. These figures from Simon Miller, who is another well-known war gamer. They're 28mm figures, but it's a really good recreation. These are the legionaries in front of there's the marching camp. These are the legionaries. These are the auxiliaries. There's the auxiliary cavalry. And here's Cargacus's chariots, and then mass ranks on the top. And then that's the view from the Roman auxiliaries looking towards the mass ranks of the far northern Britons. Sadly, in the game we fought, Legate Elliott and Legate Priestley lost Roman Britain. Because as you can see here, Cargacus personally, here he is in his big horn helmet, actually turned the day and we actually lost. So for us, at the end of this battle, Agricola committed suicide. The 2 worst legates in wargaming history. But Agricola did win. And the campaign's very similar, actually, to 18th century records of the Culloden campaign, actually. Same kind of region, same kind of campaigning. And the Romans pursue the Britons as far as they can. And it's at this point that Agricola then orders the Classis Britannia to circumnavigate the whole main island of Britain, which is the point, I think, when you can say the Romans can claim very briefly that they conquered the whole main island of Britain. Could make a case that they not conquer the Highlands of Scotland. Could make a case that the native Britons there would come back. But at that one snapshot in time, the Romans have conquered the far north, the whole main island of Britain. And Domitian knows it too. So Domitian suddenly, when word reaches him, lifts his head up and says, oh, that's interesting. Bit of martial glamour for me. So it's Domitian who orders the building of the monumental arch at Richborough on the east coast of Kent. The fort you see today, a brilliant site, the fort you see today is much later. It's probably Caerhausen or Electon, a Saxon shore fort. That's built from reused stone from the earlier town and port, and the monumental arch clad in Carrara marble from Italy. Probably one of the biggest arches in the whole of the Roman world, actually. And that's the view as you come into the harbour. Very important because for the Romans, I think Richborough was the imperial gateway to Roman Britain. So it's where the governor would come over when he was new, Agricola as an example, to actually put his sword on and say, I'm now in charge of my province. You go through the monumental arch. You can still walk on those foundations today. It's absolutely amazing. So what happened to Agricola later in life? Well, he is the golden boy of the Roman military. He's clearly the master commander of the military establishment in the Roman world towards the end of the 1st century AD. Sadly, he's got an emperor who doesn't value that because the emperor is actually probably jealous of him. So he's recalled in AD 84. From that point there, over the next decade or so, the Roman presence in the far north gradually drops down to the Staingate line between the Solway Firth and the Tyne, which later becomes the line of Hadrian's Wall. He never takes command again. So he either goes back to Rome, probably, or it may have gone back to southeastern France. Never takes command again, despite being the leading general of the age. Certainly because of jealousy on the part of Domitian. Domitian keeps a very close eye on him, actually. And one of the stories Tacitus tells is that Domitian always had somebody on hand every time Agricola was ill, just in case he died, so he could scratch it off people to watch out for. Then he dies on the 23rd of August, AD 93. Domitian's assassinated 18th of September 1896, bringing to an end the Flavian dynasty and the beginning of the Nervo-Trajanic dynasty. And then Tacitus publishes his first book, which is the Agricola, around AD 98. So what's the real legacy of this then? Well, I think the real legacy is the political settlement of Britain today. So Agricola tried to get Domitian to give him permission to conquer Ireland. It was refused. Who knows what would have happened if the Romans had conquered Ireland? Would you have had Mediterranean-style stone-built settlements built in Ireland? Who knows? But if it was part of the Roman world, its trajectory of that island in the British archipelago would have been different. The Romans don't stay in the far north, and it's only Severus in the early 3rd century that tries it again, and again that ultimately fails with his death in York. So Scotland goes in a different direction as well, what we call Scotland today, the far north of Britain. So you can see with those acts of Domitian in particular, with Ireland and then pulling Agricola back from the far north of the main island of Britain, that actually events then still affect the world today. So the next time you watch the Calcutta Cup, when England plays Scotland at rugby, just think it's almost certainly down to Domitian not letting Agricola stay there. If you want to see me talking more about the wider Roman world, Channel 5 tomorrow night, I'm on a show with Dan Snow, where we're talking about the life of Pompey. That's me standing on the Basilica in Pompeii, actually, where I get to assassinate Dan Snow. And there are my contact details and some of my books. My name is Simon Elliott. Thank you for being a great audience. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Simon. And so who? This microphone's not working, but I do have another. So if you've got any questions, please put your hand up.
Sir.
Okay, sorry, is it? You say, yeah, please keep the microphone close to your lips.
Sorry, you said that your three least favourite emperors. Who are your most favourite emperors? I guess Vespasian being one of.
For those people who know me, they'll know that I'm going to say Septimius Severus first. So Septimius Severus, Trajan, and Vespasian. But remember, I'm a military historian, so I do like my warrior emperors. But those. I'll just say it again, shall I? Septimius Severus, Vespasian, and Trajan, because I like warrior emperors.
Okay, any more? Certainly got, oh yeah, okay.
When Agricola was thinking about Ireland, was there any evidence that Irish support had been lent to those tribes in the Ayrshire part in their rebellion after he was running around the Highlands?
The only mention that we have, we know that the Romans had an ongoing trade with Ireland and their new Ireland, so it wasn't unknown to them. And also you have a prince from Irish royalty, as it were, who's actually in the Roman camp at the time because he's estranged with his family. And that's probably the source of a lot of the local knowledge that he's been told, and maybe the idea was that he would be the new Coltimandua or something like that and help the Romans. This is why Agricola thought they could do it with a legion, but not much more than that. I mean, basically, all we have to rely on is Tacitus.
Okay, Simon, got a couple of questions from the online audience. From Martin Doherty. Logistics, how did the Romans manage to feed so many soldiers when on campaign?
It's a great question. So it's all about the sea and rivers. So for example, in the campaigns of Agricola in 79 through to 83, when he's campaigning in the Scottish lowlands and then into Aberdeenshire, he's got logistics bases at places like South Shields and Corbridge, all on rivers or the coast, and the grain and all the other supplies are being sent up to where the military are using the river systems and the coast. There's a great example at Intuchill. Remember, Intuchill is a legionary fortress built by Legio 20 Valeria Victrix on the Tay, and it was only in use for 10 months. And when the Romans dismantled it and started coming south again, they took everything with them so the natives couldn't actually have the stuff to use themselves, including all the ironwork from the nails, except that the Romans, for some reason, couldn't actually get the iron out of there. So they buried the nails, and there's about 20 tons of Roman iron nails buried to stop the native Britons having them. That's relevant because the iron that made the nails came from the Roman iron industry in the Weald. So that's going all the way up the east coast. So it's all about the coast and river systems.
Thank you. And another question online from Dick Bateman. What happened to the Aberdeenshire region after Mons Graupius? Did any Romans remain to administer the region?
Again, it's part of the wider story, only for a brief time. So I think you've probably got them staying at that far north for about a year, but not much more than that.
Okay, anyone here in the room? Any more questions?
Gentleman at the end.
In front.
the gentleman who let me use his draft earlier on to keep cool.
Was there a particular season that the Romans would plan to start their campaign?
Great question. So in the classical world, you're always going to campaign probably between the beginning of May and the beginning of October. And then if it's worthwhile carrying on, so for example, the Claudian invasion of Britain was probably towards the end of October. So that was a later campaign. But usually the banker period is between May and October. We're talking about the far north of Britain now. And we do know, as an example, in the 3rd century, when Severus campaigns there, that the weather was horrendous to the extent it might have caused a famine because the harvest failed. So when the Romans are campaigning in the far north, they have to factor in that it's not the Mediterranean, right? It's like Game of Thrones in the far north or Tolkien in Mordor. It's going to be difficult for them. But these are the Romans, and they're used to doing it. You know, they will overcome adversity if they need to. Good question.
Okay. There was one more from online, which I hope I've remembered properly, but it's was the conquest of the far north unsuccessful because the Romans weren't able to pursue their usual policy of divide and conquer and recruit local chieftains to come over to their side, or was it just that the area was too hard to pacify before they could do that?
It's a really good question, that is. I actually think you need the elites to buy into the Roman way of life. So the Romans have to sell them the idea, because if the elites don't, the Romans can kill them. Somebody else can come through, but it's not the people who are the bosses, as it were. So the elites have to buy into the Roman way of life, and in the far north of Britain, they don't. No matter how you colour it, they don't. I don't know whether it's economic. I actually personally think the people of the far north of Britain just weren't having it, and they proved really tough opponents for the Romans. You know, Mons Graupius is the only meeting engagement, full fat battle. Other than that, you have 4 centuries of guerrilla warfare. And that's why the north of England in the Roman period, in the province, is a place of difference, because you need that bigger military presence there.
Okay, anyone in the room?
Is Calcutta up again?
Yep, okay.
If you were a tourist in northern Britain, where would you go to have a look at Roman remains?
Amazing question. Are you going to go?
I would love to, yeah. Just tell me where.
Lincoln, York, then on to Corbridge. Don't miss out the museum in Carlisle, it's beautiful. Hadrian's Wall, you've got loads of places to choose. Housesteads, Bird Oswald, Binderlander. Don't forget the Great Northern Museum in Newcastle, which is also beautiful. In fact, there's my email. If you email me, I'll send you a list. I lead tours up there. It's amazing, absolutely amazing. I love Hadrian's Wall.
I've got a question, Simon. I remember from studying Tacitus's Agricola that the speech he puts into the mouth of the leader of the Caledonians, Calgacus, who may or may not have been a real person, it's an incredibly eloquent speech. And of course, we all know about the notion of Pax Romana, how the Romans kept peace through strength. But in the mouth of Calgacus, he says to his troops before the battle, they created desolation and they call it peace. That struck me, I remember reading it at the time. Is that Tacitus criticizing imperial Roman policy?
I think this is Tacitus writing for his audience, because his audience are elite men in the Roman world, the imperial centre, and I think he's writing specifically for his audience. And these are people who understand all the nuancing, which we don't. They understand all the nuancing. But I'll bring you back to the point I started with. Always remember, for all the nicety that you get in the Roman world, that the Roman military was an industrial scale killing machine.
Indeed. And probably got time for a final question, if anyone has one. Anyone? We've got another one here, but yeah.
The end of the Roman period in Britain, in your opinion, when do you think the last non-native Roman soldiers left Britain?
That's a great question. Well, the last field armies almost certainly left 406, 407 with Constantine III. So 406, 407, leaving the native Limitanni in place. That's a good question.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all very much for coming, and please join me in thanking Simon Elliott.
Thank you.